A warm welcome to everybody to this webinar on the Zinnov mid-market GCC report readout. There is a lot of context as to why we have started to segment and release these reports on the overall industry, which I will get to in a minute. But I thought it would be good to just maybe walk you through the agenda for today, and then also maybe introduce Zinnov a little bit in terms of the work that we have done, and then jump straight into the content for the session itself, right? To introduce myself, I'm a partner at Zinnov. I lead the GCCs business for India for the organization. I have about 15 years of experience overall, and I've particularly been with Zinnov for 11 of those years, helping GCCs set up, scale, and mature their operations from the India ecosystem. Today's session is relatively short. We only have it scheduled for 1 hour. And the goal is to walk you through the insights and all of our learnings in terms of what have we learned from the mid-market GCC playbook that we believe could potentially be learnings for the larger ecosystem as well, right? So I will walk you through the learnings. We'll go through a few slides in terms of the scale as well as the value that these mid-market GCCs have been able to create for the larger enterprise organizations. But at any point in time, please feel free to continue to use the chat. Mahin called it out already, but please feel free to continue to use the chat to be able to post your questions, any opinions, comments, etc. as we go through the slides as well. I'll pause at two places. One, once I've finished the scale of the ecosystem, and the second part where I've talked about the value creation and what are some of the key differentiators for mid-market GCCs vis-a-vis the larger ecosystem, right? Before I get into the slides itself, just a quick introduction to Zinnov as an organization. We are a 23-year-old management consulting firm. We're boutique in that we have focused on specifically catering to technology organizations across the board in being able to impact their bottom line as well as their top line. We have two major practice areas. One, of course, is a practice that caters to the services organizations in the ecosystem to help them with their top line growth and go-to-market strategy, partnership strategies, etc. And the other big practice that exists within Zinnov is what we call the GCC, or the Globalization Excellence Practice. As you can see from this particular slide, the Globalization Excellence Practice looks at helping GCCs or global teams right from the time that it is in an early stage boardroom conversation. So your design and discovery, your setup advisory, and then right up until your 15, 20 of existence, when you are starting to look at big bet transformation areas, as well as looking at the new age workforce of the future. Zinnov has worked across the entire spectrum and life cycle with GCCs to be able to design and implement their strategy, right? A couple of the areas and how we usually track the growth and the evolution of the ecosystem and thereby how our offerings are structured is essentially we've noticed that most GCCs will go through waves of transformation, right? When you start off as an outpost and then you subsequently move to becoming a transformation hub for the global organization. And across your journey, there will be several key questions that are burning needs for the organization itself. So continually and at any point in time, you're constantly asking yourself, how do I maximize value from my global team to the headquarter location? How do I continue to attract and retain the best-in-class talent in this journey to greater value? Where will my next big idea, product, or process come from? And how do I continue to leverage digital technologies to drive greater efficiency as well as top line and impact and innovation for the organization? And as you can see, all of our offerings and interventions are structured across being able to help you answer these very questions for the org itself. One special aspect that sort of separates us or differentiates us from the rest of the industry is what we call the GCC Accelerator platform. This is very similar to what AWS is to Amazon. It used to power the internal organization until it became a spin-off practice of its own. And that's very similar to how we operate as well. This is a productized version of the access to all of our insights, playbooks, as well as the access to our community. And sessions like this are a big part of the GCC platform where it becomes a forum for the cross exchange of ideas as well as input to learn from the best in class in the industry. We'll double click a little bit on the platform itself. The goal is that we disseminate information in Zinnov in three ways. One, of course, we have our industry insights. The other is ecosystem events such as this. And the third one is where we have consulting credits for any queries or responses that do not get addressed through the first two, right? This is our only subscription-based offering, and some of the themes that we tend to focus on as a part of this offering is leadership, talent, technology, and innovation, right? For any other information needs, we have all of these white boxes are basically standalone interventions on their own, which means that they will have a design and an implement phase to each of these particular white boxes. So that's a little bit about Zinnov. If you have any queries on the work we do, if anything sparks interest, please feel free, of course, to get in touch with the team post this webinar. But let's get right into it, right? Earlier in the year, we had embarked on this journey to understand what are the different personas of GCCs that exist in the ecosystem today. And we have broadly realized that about 90% of the ecosystem is basically a specific type of GCCs, which we could broadly segment into mid-market and as well as large enterprise and mega GCCs, right? There are, of course, smaller players, sub $1 billion, etc., but they constitute a much smaller share of the overall GCC landscape. So then we decided that while we would potentially continue to study what is the playbook for success going into, let's say, an AI led world, we decided to understand what makes each of these personas tick, and that is where the genesis of the mid-market GCC report really happened, right? They don't currently constitute a massive share of the market as opposed to a large and mega GCCs, but they have perfected this one playbook of where they operate and move with agility. They're able to lead with global influence right from day zero. And the way that they structure themselves is already extremely future ready and influential, right? And so it warranted that we understand the DNA of these organizations a little bit better. And before I get into what makes these organizations tick, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about the ecosystem of mid-market GCCs in terms of scale. So let's just understand what this ecosystem looks like in terms of numbers. Today, we have about nearly 500 mid-market GCCs that constitute about a north of 2 lakh in terms of the employment that they generate within the GCC ecosystem. So from an employment perspective, they are about 10% of the overall talent that is employed within this ecosystem. Now, the other thing that we are starting to see also is that they are usually tend to be single unit setups, which means that unlike the larger enterprise GCCs, mid-market GCCs will operate and scale typically in one location, and it is very rare for them in the mid-market segment to have more than one location where they set up and scale. Overall, in terms of the numbers, we are currently at about 1,800 plus GCCs, and mid-market GCCs constitute about 27% of that particular segment. What have been some of the drivers to push this ecosystem forward? One, of course, is they need access to premium talent, especially from an engineering, digital, as well as domain specialist stream. And this is supported by the scale of the skilled graduates that are entering the ecosystem every year. Another big, reason for success of growth of these GCCs is that there has been a significant push and incentivization by the local governments in Telangana, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu to be able to bring these GCCs to India. But possibly the most important advantage that they encounter when they come to an ecosystem like India is that unlike your larger GCCs, mid-market GCCs may not have as deep pockets, and their tolerance for margin improvement is a lot lesser. So their runways are typically a lot shorter than if you were to look at any other GCC player in the ecosystem. And because of the cost arbitrage as well as the deep, mature talent that India represents for a lot of these enterprises, mid-market GCCs have found a sweet spot, all right? And that is why this is the biggest reason we anticipate this ecosystem to grow significantly in the next couple of years, right? So don't be fooled by the numbers in terms of the fact that they only account for just under a third. This share of mid-market GCC in terms of the talent that they will employ will definitely go to a much larger share in the next 3 to 5 years. Just a quick double click in terms of these 27% mid-market, the 500 odd mid-market GCCs, it is dominated by the software internet vertical. So these are predominantly your SaaS enterprise software organizations that constitute the lion's share of the companies today. One could argue that there is a specific DNA in terms of the ease of offshoring, a function or a product like that. And we can get into that a little bit in the discussion part of this webinar. And of course, I think in terms of where these mid-market GCCs are located, not vastly different from the larger ecosystem. It's the usual suspects of Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, and Mumbai NCR, which constitute the largest share in terms of the number of mid-market GCCs themselves, right? Just very quickly, so one of the things that we did in the lens of mid-market is that we talked about, GCCs in India, which are a share of the Fortune 500, and only about 34% of Fortune 500 GCCs actually have a representation in terms of an offshore unit in India. In the mid-market, this number is even smaller. On this number side, it may look like it's not very promising. You have to understand it in terms of the significant potential that there is, especially given their time to speed and time to scale is much, much shorter as opposed to an enterprise GCC. And we'll talk about that in subsequent slides as well. So truly, I think where a lot of policymakers, organizations that work with a lot of enterprises are seeing potential in the growth of this landscape is that because they make these decisions to move a lot faster, this share of the pie is going to go up significantly because there is so much underutilized potential in the overall ecosystem itself. Right. We also do believe that certain other verticals which have not featured, in the top 5, like your retail, healthcare, etc., will start to become extremely prominent in the overall mix pie chart in terms of overall share. Now, one of the things, and that was the scale, I'll just maybe look at a couple of questions. Yeah, so I think one very interesting question, are we seeing any positive traction for R&D GCCs in the last 1 to 3 years? I think if I could paraphrase that, Ravi, you're basically asking, are you seeing an evolution in the quality of work? Absolutely. I think about 4 or 5 years ago, the share of ER&D, as we used to call it in terms of the overall ecosystem, used to be sub 1/3, which is sub 33%. Now that share has gone up to nearly 50%. So about between 45 and 50% is what constitutes ER&D workloads out of the overall GCC ecosystem. The same trends reflect in the mid-market share as well, and we'll touch upon that. For mid-market, the ER&D is actually a much larger share of it, because typically it will be one global CTO or CIO who is the decision maker for the mid-market, and CTOs seem to be leading with a lot of influence in this particular sector. We'll come to that, but broadly, short answer to your question is yes, right? Okay. So one of the things that we also see are that when it comes to decision making, and the typical crutch that we see with the large or an enterprise GCC is that they tend to take a lot more time because they tend to be extremely consensus driven cultures when it comes to taking large decisions on globalization, right? So if you compare notes against the mid-market GCC, you will start to see that they will be a lot more agile in their decision making and in their time to scale for within the India region itself. So let's take a couple of metrics, right, that we have been tracking on the ecosystem. The time for a GCC setup in a larger enterprise GCC will take anywhere from 2 to 3 years. The major reason for that, like I called out, is they tend to be extremely consensus-driven cultures. Almost always they will involve not just the CXO level leadership, but they'll also tend to involve the next in line BU leadership, because there will be significant VPs and SVPs outside of the CXO who have a lot of influence depending on the size of the teams they lead, the share of the revenue for the overall organization, and so on, right? Even when it comes to the number of leaders that get involved in the decision making, it's almost close to 15, 20 leaders for a larger enterprise GCC, and in mid-market, this number is in single digits, right? So at any given point in time, the decision making in a mid-market is limited to to the top 5, 6 CXO suite executives. Your greatest stake will sit with the CHRO, CEO, and CTO of the organization. And in several cases, the chief product officer, etc., may get involved as well to a large extent. Of course, the CFO is involved in any enterprise strategy. Even when it comes to the number of leaders who believe that they have skin in the game and get directly involved in the setup, for a large enterprise GCC on any given day, we see that the business case creation has to happen with 20 plus leaders at any point, right? So all of them need access to the scorecard. All of them need to understand what is what is success looking like, how's the setup moving the needle. But in the case of mid-market, the decision making and the council of decision making actually becomes smaller as the GCC setup decision gets taken. So you will start to see that in the case of a mid-market setup, the scorecard, the governance will start to get limited to maybe 3 to 5 leaders once the decision to move global has been made. The other part, of course, the time to hire for the first 50 hires stays the same because ultimately your talent availability is the same. But even the number of global leaders that get involved is significantly lower as the mid-market GCC evolves and starts to hit stable state. Okay. The other big part that we see is that because of this agility and because they have clear charters from the get-go, the one other thing in terms of the DNA of the mid-market GCC is the margin for error is a lot less, right? Because you're small, because there's constant eye on the margin and thereby the contribution of the GCC to the overall EBITDA of the organization and the valuation. Because that tolerance level and that runway is so short, they start off with, incidentally enough, reaching a higher maturity stage a lot faster, right? So there's no room to get it wrong as much as you would with, let's say, an enterprise GCC. And because of that, they all have a very clear portfolio strategy and clear charter in place from day one. This has been very interesting because it's almost a chicken to egg scenario. We don't know what starts which one. Is it the clear charter from day one that leads to the higher maturity, or is it that GCCs here are also able to step up and continually be able to enable that flywheel so that it stays mature? But the sustenance of maturity has been a proven model in the mid-market segment, right? So in terms of numbers, not very different from what the large GCCs operate and look like. But it's interesting because they reach the portfolio hub stage, which is a third stage of maturity, almost 2 times faster than an enterprise GCC does. And you have to understand that the mid-market GCC as a segment has truly established and grown only post-COVID. So it's only really been an uptick post-2021. And the growth in the numbers, but also for this segment to reflect the same maturity levels and in the transformation hub be a little bit higher than the large GCC really does take something. So clearly there's something there in terms of value to learn from these organizations, even for the larger organizations, right? The one thing that we did also validate is that they reach higher maturity and they also are able to thereby lead with significant influence. So it's not uncommon to see several GCC heads of mid-market GCCs report into a CXO level leader. So CTO is relatively common, but we've also seen significant examples of mid-market GCC heads who roll up directly into the CEO staff. So there's almost a dotted line or a skip level reporting into the CEO directly because they are expected to contribute to the top line and to the EBITDA of the organization from relatively early on in their journey. It's also showcased in the intensity of the talent pool. So architect intensity, product management intensity are metrics where mid-market GCCs continue to fare better than their counterparts on the large GCC side, right? This is evidenced in a couple of the examples that you can see on the slide itself. So one of the things that mid-market GCCs have been able to create a significant visibility with their headquarters, especially when you compare them to their larger counterparts. And I do want to call out that this is definitely one lesson in terms of leaders being able to lead with influence that mid-market GCCs have created a really good playbook for. So we have Vishal Bhasin from Data Axle as an example that I can take up. Data Axle is probably a 6-year-old GCC at most, maybe 7, in the India ecosystem, and he has been CTO for the last 1.5 to 2 years, right? So in that sense, already a success story, global CTO mandate sitting out of India. as opposed to if you had looked at an enterprise GCC where this similar role would probably have had to be exported to back to the headquarters itself. Another key role, of course, is Sir from Comvault, became the chief customer officer several years ago. And there is now, I think, a playbook that these GCCs are almost creating where India is becoming the playground to groom the next in line leaders for the overall organization. And when I say groom the next in line leaders, it is not just from a site operations perspective. It is the ability to groom these leaders to be able to take on global mandates for the company itself, right? One other trait that we do see of mid-market, which is unlike a lot of the larger GCCs, is that a significant share of them will have dual roles. So what that effectively means is it's very rare for us to see a mid-market GCC head who does not have a functional or a business unit role along with the ability to oversee their site operations. There's important implications here just in terms of easing up their day-to-day job. So they're able to focus on, the more strategic initiatives for the organization. But this dual hatting or double hatting of the GCC heads is also extremely common for mid-market GCC heads. And in many cases, not something we see reflected in the larger GCCs, where there are several examples. It's almost the flip, where several GCC heads in the large GCCs tend to have only site operations and governor roles and not necessarily any business unit or functional roles that they have, right? Now, one of the things that we are starting to see is, so of course, we talked a little bit about the DNA of the mid-market GCCs. We talked a little bit about, their time to scale and key metrics where they seem to do better on the maturity aspect. One of the things we did want to do is double click a little bit more in terms of how are they able to actually, so what have been the enablers of this change for the mid-market segment itself, right? On this slide, you will see two major sets of priority areas if you are a GCC leader in India today. The foundational or the core pillars continue to be, and this is irrespective of your size, irrespective of the segment you operate in. How do you, one, look at AI in the construct of your GCC today? How do you create the next set of global leaders? How do you build an understanding of the customer within the enterprise and within the GCC? But of course, your focus does continue to stay on keeping up your efficiencies, right? So cost optimization, productivity improvements continue to be specific focus areas. Now, that is something that applies to you as a GCC leader, irrespective of which segment you operate in. Interestingly enough, with respect to the mid-market GCCs, their additional priorities do seem to have come up. One, how does a GCC continue to stay agile and lean? So they have never been, and nor will they ever be in the numbers game if you are a mid-market. How do you continue to increase the throughput of innovation? And what's been interesting for us to note is that mid-market GCCs have looked at innovation from day zero. They have not waited until they have hit a certain scale or a certain headcount intensity. They have just said, we will just look at innovation from the get-go itself, right? The other thing that is non-negotiable for them is the quality of the talent, and specialist domain talent is extremely important for a mid-market GCC to nurture and create. And of course, be a hub for India to global process transformations. So you will see several mid-market GCCs operate, and pilot specific initiatives in India, which will then automatically become a process transformation in India, but be adopted by the overall global enterprise, right? And one of the biggest trends that we are seeing is that they are emerging as impact hubs for deep technologies. So a lot of your work and experiments in AI, ML, in cloud, in cybersecurity and data science are being seeded in the mid-market GCCs. And they are not waiting to be told. A lot of these leaders are just being given the mandates either by the global organizations or picking it up for themselves. But there is no wait and watch in their approach to being able to nurture these capabilities in their respective India teams, right? What that does, and implicitly, is it makes it almost how do I put this? Like a test bed for the overall enterprise, right? And it makes it very agile in terms of you become indispensable to the headquarters right from the get-go. And there is no wait and watch in terms of proving your capability, etc. You're just expected to lead the charter, and basically the India leadership is expected to just run with it, right? One other thing, of course, that we did was we tracked where is the maturity of this ecosystem itself. And I do want to take the lens that this is a relatively younger ecosystem where the true takeoff for mid-market GCCs really only happened post-COVID. But even against that lens, a lot of them have reached higher stages of maturity much faster. Of course, this is reflective and they reflect what the larger trend in the industry is in terms of the current maturity numbers. So we have the maximum number of mid-market GCCs in the second stage of maturity, which is satellite, and but a significant share, nearly a third, which are in portfolio hub, right? So that's an important metric to keep in mind because they have taken a significantly lower time to be able to achieve this pace of maturity overall as compared to the non-mid-market segment. The other thing, and what's been interesting for us to note, is that mid-market GCCs have been able to imbibe the best of both worlds. So there will be, the ability to lead with global influence, access to global customers, which is almost like a large enterprise DNA. But in the way that they are structured, they almost operate like a large enterprise SaaS startup, right? Extremely well funded, very well established. And in that sense, that is important because obviously the ownership of the work and having a seat at the right table, no one can really argue is extremely important for the success of a GCC to higher maturity levels, right? So what you see now in front of you is a side-by-side comparison of a large, extremely successful Indian enterprise SaaS startup. We can't even call them a startup anymore because they seem to be a well-established name. And a software mid-market GCCs that have been in the ecosystem for about 5 to 8 years now. If you notice that in the way they are structured, the organization structures almost mimic each other. Um, all of the functional leaders at the organization India level roll up into their global counterparts. There is no dotted line, solid line, and matrix reporting that this mid-market GCC particularly deals with. There's a very clear mandate in terms of there will be a chief customer officer, there will be a CTO, and there will be a chief product officer, and each of them will have a global counterpart who is almost always in their succession plan, who will be sitting out of the GCC itself, right? This is an interesting observation because what it takes a large enterprise GCC to get this kind of seat at the table over a decade to be able to do this. And mid-market GCCs have been able to bring this kind of level of influence a lot sooner in their journey. And if you understand that construct as you do, you realize that having a seat at the right table almost leapfrogs your journey to higher maturity, right? So in the early part, it is about getting the quick wins. But once you're able to establish quick wins and your reporting levels have switched up, your ability to continually change, switch up, be a disruptor, drive the next set of global products and processes from India becomes a lot easier with every subsequent win, as well as if it is structurally enabled for the org itself. So this is just a quick observation that we had made. If you were to overlay this with the reporting structure of a large enterprise GCC, you actually do see that there will be several matrices. The India leader will have several lines of influence that they may have to look into. Not a lot of large or enterprise GCC leaders roll up into the CXO level immediately. And that is definitely one differentiator for mid-market itself. The other big part of it is that there have been certain specific focus areas that mid-market GCCs have particularly doubled down on. One, it is non-negotiable for them as organizations right from the start to be able to focus on creating specialist roles. Two, they introduce middle management relatively quickly, which means that it's very common for them to have top-down build of the GCC itself. While they hire in tandem talent at the bottom of the pyramid, the first roles that they fill most critically are the ones that sit in the mid to senior bracket for the overall organizations. They also are becoming hubs for process standardization. So significant amount of work for mid-market GCCs is going in being able to structure frameworks around delivery governance, agile rollouts, for example, adoption, performance systems, etc. Because they run these as pilots in the India GCC and then roll it up as a global initiative, right? right from the beginning, along with ownership and a deep understanding of the customer, speed, pace, agility of decision making are very much a part of their cultural DNA. And they usually create cultures where autonomy thrives for the leadership, right? So they don't tend to get caught up in the bureaucracy. Partly, and they're guilty of not having a lot of scalable processes also in several cases, but they almost operate like large startups, as we saw earlier, right? They also tend to be flatter in terms of the structure itself, and also more agile in terms of their ability to leverage external partnerships to help them on their scale journey, right? So a lot of them prefer to use flexible models on the scale aspect, either from a BOT or a GCC as a service models, which helps them focus on their core engineering, core technology, core shared services charters, while they are able to outsource or offload the day-to-day decision making on the operate aspects of the GCC itself. And that definitely is part of their DNA for success, right? So these are a couple of the examples where even these mid-market GCCs are rethinking the core L&D HR processes for the global organization, right? So they tend to be one, process design hubs. They become the place where a lot of foundational frameworks are built. So a lot of your work around systems of records, organization structuring, the playbook around portfolio allocation and talent scale, etc., tends to be designed and operated from the mid-market segment. The other thing that tends to happen is because they tend to learn from their larger peers in an ecosystem that is very mature like India, certain policies that enable the retention of your key talent also get seated in the GCC for mid-market. So onboarding processes, buddy programs, retention mechanisms. A very common one is long-term incentives, right, as a retention mechanism. That tends to be something that these mid-market GCCs are able to quickly experiment with, create a framework around, and then have the entire organization adapt that particular framework. Same rules apply even on the performance management side. So career pathing is a big focus for mid-market GCCs. We'll get into why in maybe a little bit more detail in a subsequent slide. But if you notice, you may be a mid-market and your global may not be sensitive to the competition for talent or the flux in the talent in an ecosystem like India. Whether you like it or not, as an organization, you are competing with some of the behemoths like your FANGs, your Microsofts, Googles, etc. of the world, especially before that core specialist talent. And because your needs are converging in becoming AI first enterprises, right? And a key part of how do you differentiate yourself as a mid-market GCC tends to be how you design your compensation, career path, and rewards and recognition programs. And finally, of course, a lot of work happening around, which extends, of course, from the entire employee experience pillar, is work around your benefits, your CSR strategy, and so on. So they're really rethinking core L&D processes, even in some cases teaching the global enterprise and being able to create this particular value for the org. Where do we think the industry is headed from here? The DNA of the future mid-market GCCs will not be significantly different from what a large enterprise GCC is looking at. It's just they're going to probably be able to move a little bit faster and lead with more influence. Already, even though the ecosystem is relatively young, if you look at it in the lens of the overall ecosystem, these GCCs are looking at influencing the top line already. So there is a lot of work that they are putting in terms of being able to own end-to-end products from India, access the customer already, and be able to create or nurture the talent accordingly. They also do have a lot of work that is happening around being very startup DNA focused. So innovation is a key charter from the get-go. They're also quite open to being able to leverage partnerships in order to be able to create this innovation throughput or increase the innovation throughput from the GCC. Additionally, I think valuation continues to be a key metric that a lot of these mid-market GCCs are held accountable to, very simply because a significant chunk of them are also private equity firm backed, right? So we're seeing the Warburg Pincus's, KKR's, TPG, Thoma Bravos of the world start to look at the India organization as a means to improve the valuation. And a big part of the valuation is the innovation throughput and net new product that you are able to drive to increase customers and stickiness and customer lifetime value, right? They also tend to, like I called out, will continue to have decentralized governance, which means that they will move to flatter structures, Every leader in the GCC will report into their global counterpart, continue to be on their succession plan, and extremely autonomous with more democratic sort of decision making from the GCC itself. It's not free of challenges, of course. I'll just the last few slides, and I can see there are quite a few questions. I'll take up the questions post this. This is not, so the mid-market GCC as the growth of the overall ecosystem, we believe is going to constitute 40% in the next 5 years of the overall number of GCCs in India, right? This is a significant percentage jump from where they are today. And what are going to be some of the growth drivers? They're going to continue to be hubs of global process transformation. They will also become a test bed of global leaders. So what India will be is like a leadership incubation sort of center almost, where a lot of the global leaders, especially in the CTO, CIO, the GBS organization, will be nurtured here and then start to take on global mandates, right? They will also continue to work with the government. They are already on the radar of central policymakers, but they will continue to double down on this to be able to influence policy in the India ecosystem itself. And of course, all the next generational products will also come from these mid-market organizations. But it's not been a journey that is free of challenges. One of the things that we do believe mid-market GCCs encounter is their ability to attract and retain talent, especially in the earlier career stages, right? A big part of this is that they don't have very established brands in the ecosystem as compared to a lot of the larger GCCs itself. So in this case, of course, there are interventions that you can run in terms of if you have seen that your predominant sources of talent from a tier 1, tier 2 perspective seem to be converging on a specific set of colleges, or from the developer ecosystem, it does help to have very robust partnership programs, co-branding programs launched with these orgs, right? The other part of it is when they start off, they don't have a lot of standardized operating procedures. And that puts, in many cases, we have also seen puts a lot of pressure on the India GCC because it directly feeds into employee experience, the quality of engineering and development, as well as thereby the longer term customer experience, right? Specifically, where mid-market GCCs do tend to struggle is cross-functional and cross-geo collaboration, as opposed to enterprise GCCs that do tend to have a lot more processes in place, which are more standardized from a day-to-day perspective. Also, pockets don't tend to be as deep. So it is difficult, and we recognize this in being able to sustain partnerships with your services organizations, your startups, your academia from a year-to-year basis, right? Also, that whole pace of decision making, the need for speed, as we call it in mid-market, means that in many cases, you can lose the forest for the trees. And it becomes very important to sensitize global leaders to the fact that POCs, there is a time to ramp up in terms of innovation throughput, but it also helps to be agile in your partnership programs itself. So focus on a few startups and universities, look at, maybe innovation pods in terms of being able to deep structured collaboration needs to be enabled with all of these external entities. And of course, brand recall continues to be a pain point, in which case you do need to invest in targeted brand building events for the GCC itself, especially if India is part of, the long-term strategy, even from a scale and a headcount perspective, right? So this becomes particularly important. The GCC should be known for the thought leadership piece of it, right? So it should be the genesis of several thought leadership for the overall organization needs to be established in the GCC itself. And that is really how mid-market GCCs can establish as well as differentiate themselves from the larger enterprise. So this is my final slide, but really what are, aspects that you should look at? So of course, having a specialist clear charter, don't go breadth, at least initially, start to look at depth, shift from focus to ownership of entire end-to-end ownership of processes, products from the get-go, be able to look at high impact measurable outcomes also from the get-go. So yes, cost efficiency will never go out of fashion, but can you also start to look at innovation throughput, top line impact from early on in your journey? And you will realize as a leader where this pivot will also be available or come for you, right? The other thing is be able to structure yourselves to be able to deliver to that charter. So agile practices from the get-go, the use of technology early on in terms of being able to look at AI analytics in terms of driving better customer as well as employee experience. Also make sure that, any processes around knowledge and IP are strengthened because that becomes extremely critical as well for the organization. From a talent and leadership perspective, the focus on specialist and niche domain, of course, helps, but you do need to look at having career paths, very well established, and there should be parity between global and India. Experienced external leaders strategically is going to be extremely important. In India, it's almost we've created a perfect playbook of leaders who have been abroad, worked with global organizations in global locations, and then come back to the ecosystem, right? This becomes the most coveted talent, and these experienced leaders are leaders who are able to drive the vision and the charter for the mid-market GCC itself. And finally, have a very clear pathway to higher maturity, which means continually have priorities such as hiring high quality talent, staying lean on the process and operations side, being able to look at the right metrics and designing the right scorecard in terms of value metrics early on in your journey over operational day-to-day metrics, right? So all of those tend to be governance non-negotiables that need to be adopted irrespective of where you are in your journey. So that's effectively what I had. The overall report, of course, is a much more detailed version of what I went through. I think what I showed you was effectively just the tip of the iceberg. But we have done a double click on each of the key differentiators of the mid-market segment itself. We've also got several case studies, etc., which you can get access to in the report. But thank you so much. I will probably just open up my chat for questions.
Hey, Namita.
Hi.
Hey. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. There are a lot of questions, and since the last few slides were on the challenges part, the couple of questions that we have is one of the challenges for the mid-market GCC is the dependency on the key leader who builds grounds up like a startup with culture, innovation, etc. But after 3-4 years, the headquarter tend to globalize everything and fight for control and see GCC as a threat to their HQ. So in your conversations with the GCCs, especially with the mid-market GCCs, are you seeing the similar kind of trend, or is it one-off? And if it is a one-off, what is your take on this? How should the certain GCCs should take these situations?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. Very interesting insight to see that GCC as a threat to the headquarters, right? I think typically that tends to happen when you have disconnected from the overall organizational strategy. So you are a threat to headquarters when the OKRs that you take up are not aligning to what the global organization is treating as priority. So one, level set there. Make sure that anything you are taking up as a charter, you are very clear as a leader in the mid-market GCC as to how it contributes to overall global. Two is succession planning is paramount, right? Whether the role gets exported, whether the in leader stays here and moves on to a different charter, you do need to have a strong next in line leadership that is able to communicate and thereby diversify your risk, so that it's not just dependent on that one leader to be able to continually talk about the value that the GCC is delivering, right? But if there is a disconnect in the alignment to headquarters is when your GCC will be perceived as a threat because you are being viewed as an island in the overall organization structure. So that may be the level set I would recommend.
Got it. Got it. Another question that came again on the similar lines of challenges is, initial 5 to 7 years, GCCs were set up, have a lot of energy and fanfare, but it loses the steam, right, after 5 to 7 years. So very few organizations have it in the DNA, which remains a key challenge. So the question is, let's say after 3 to 4 years of GCC journey, how should a GCC look upon and how should they align to the global HQ? Is that something which is needed? And what GCC should do at the year 3 to 4 in the GCC's transformation journey?
Sure. So I think this is classic, case of, and you're right, we absolutely see a valley where a lot of GCCs fall through the cracks, in the year 4, year 5 of existence, because they do go through an existential crisis. I think this is where the maturity framework has provided a very important lens because that pivot every few years becomes extremely important. I'll give you an example, right? In the first few years, scale and efficiency are priorities. So you can say, hey, I'll do innovation, tamjham and fanfare as was called out in the question itself. But as long as you have not built you can't build a pyramid without the foundation first, right? So your foundational aspects around being able to hire the right kind of talent, having a very strong brand, having a very clear portfolio strategy, and then being able to deliver on it so that you have your first set of wins is very important. Once you have delivery capacity, and it may not be 3, 4 years, look, the timeline is honestly just a guardrail. We've seen enough success stories in 1 or 2 years also, right? But delivery capability is definitely a baseline. From there on out, you do have to start to say, okay, I've established delivery capacity now. Now I'm able to, one, almost always you will become microcosm. So you will become a multifunction center. That is when you start to run pilots around innovation throughput, right? And so you pivot, and that pivot happens from efficiency to value creation. So the cost savings efficiency never goes away, Prashant, right? It does then have to become, okay, in net, like plus, do I look at innovation throughput? How do I now nurture my next set of leaders? Don't jump the gun. There is value in a building blocks approach. I think that needs to be maintained if you have to make sure that you don't go through the valley of death post year 5.
Got it. Got it. Now let's move to the opportunities. We have a couple of questions on that, right? What are some of the positive tractions that you're seeing in the GCC space in the last 1 to 3 years? And we're also seeing a trend of global CTO of Indian origin taking over the GCC head role. So if you can just club both and say from the mid-market perspective and the global CTO taking over the GCC head role, is that a trend that you're seeing? How it is happening?
So I'll answer your latter question first. No, I mean, I think we're seeing trends both ways. We're seeing enough, not global CTOs, but yeah, global VPs of engineering do come and take on the GCC head role. Um, we honestly don't recommend it as a long-term strategy, especially if the leader has been away from the India ecosystem for a long time. Ultimately, we do think that success is in hiring a local, experienced, seasoned leader here. But we've seen leaders go both ways. Even global in GCC heads get exported as CTOs and CIOs of the enterprise, right? So both have actually worked out. What was the first question, Prashant, in terms of what are the positive trends?
Positive tractions that you're seeing in the GCC in the last 1 to 3 years?
Yeah, so I think one is definitely the level of ownership has shifted up significantly. I think just in terms of the quality of the work that we are doing, we are no longer, just doing, like, I'll give you an example, right? BFSI, GCCs, even in mid-market, I mean, they're no longer just doing back office. A lot of the front office, mid-office work is being driven from the India GCC, right? So a lot of customer-facing innovation, a lot of customer-facing products, the next generation products are being driven from India. And that means that the quality of talent is also shifting upwards. So that's definitely one trend. The other thing that we are definitely seeing is the number of global charters that are being nurtured. So global leaders that are being nurtured in the GCCs themselves. And I think finally, one thing we definitely do believe needs to be something that GCCs double down on is customer centricity as a culture in the org. But I think quality of work and quality of leadership are the two most optimistic trends.
Got it. Last two questions, right? In your slides, you mentioned about the maturity, and of course, you work with a lot of GCCs and on the maturity framework and all, right?
Yeah.
Typically, mid-market GCCs, what's the time frame, or is time a factor, or how do you position mid-market GCs in the maturity framework? That's one. And I just want to link that question to, because a lot of financial planning for 2026 is going to start in a month's time for all the GCCs, right? So what are the top priorities that you're hearing from the ecosystem when you talk to mid-market GCCs, or generally what you're seeing that a CHRO or the CXO should focus in 2026? Because a lot of audience we have are engineering leaders and HR leaders over here.
Sure. So no, I think two things are no longer constraints for the India ecosystem, and we really do have the early movers and early adopter GCCs to thank for this, right? Scale is no longer a question, and time to value is no longer a question. I think, like I said, if you have established the foundational delivery capacity and you have your leaders in place and your key roles in place, then you could do it as soon as year 2, year 3 of existence. Of course, there is a thumb rule or an average where we've seen it takes about 4 to 5 years, for every stage of maturity pivot. But the short answer is no. We've seen enough success stories where the time or scale of headcount has not been a factor. In terms of where we think companies are reprioritizing their spends from a budgeting cycle perspective is definitely, I think the top focus is building the workforce of the future. So what that means is a lot of work on one, assessing the future readiness and the disruption index of their current workforce. Two, being able to upskill and reskill talent well. So there's a lot of investment that is they're doubling down on L&D, upskilling, reskilling programs, building internal career marketplaces for the organization. And definitely three, I think leadership nurturing. So a lot of work, by the way, has happened on like global mobility programs, right? Where you're sending talent to headquarters for short assignments, but also bringing expats in, like global leaders in to spend time with the team in India for a significant amount of time. That had completely dried up during COVID and now is again picking back up, right, in a big way. So those are, I think, some of the top priority areas, but a lot of it to do with workforce planning.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Namita. In case any of our audience have any questions, do reach out to us. Nitika, any closing comments before we wrap up the session? Namita, any closing comments before we wrap up the session?
I think the idea is that, I mean, even with the number of GCCs, and I know there's been a lot of I'm going to use the same word that one of the attendees used, which is a lot of fanfare. I still think that this is such an underutilized segment, right? GCCs in India are just going to grow from strength to strength. As in the case of any GCC, intentionality will be the key sort of differentiator and success playbook. But outside of that, if anybody has any other questions or observations, we'd be very happy to take them on board. That's it from me, Prashant. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and for being here today in the middle of the week. Thank you.
Thank you.